Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the Palisades. I'm Michael Meyers, Jouan, and I'll be your service leader today. As we begin this service, let's be reminded of the aspirations and intentions that this community was built upon. We are an intentionally diverse and inclusive congregation. Whomever you are, whatever you believe, however you identify, and whomever you love, you are welcome here. As we gather, let us take a moment to recognize the indigenous peoples whose land we stand upon, wherever we are in community. And it is the Lenape, Munsee, Ramapo people on whose land this congregation was founded. Let us give thanks to them, and may we hold their home and their land and their people in reverence today during our service. So, the title of my sermon is Being a Coder. This may seem like an odd topic for a sermon, but that's Reverend Sonia's fault. When I was asked to provide a service for this Sunday, the first thing I did was to ask Sonia if she was planning to do a service about the beginning of spring. If not, I would do one. Of course, she said she was. I doubt anything I would have come up with would have been as good as what she and Reverend Lauren Jacobs did. But still, I'm asking you to bear with me. You can stay awake through the first few parts of my sermon. I promise I will end by describing what I think is the spirituality of a coder. So to begin, I want to give you my definition of a coder. A coder is a programmer, someone who produces programs that are executed on computers. But not all programmers are coders. Many are systems engineers, or application programmers, or low-code programmers. To clarify the distinction, let me describe the properties of a coder in more detail. Coders are consistent. Asked to write the same program again, the results will be very similar, if not identical. That can't be said of other programmers. Many people program by accretion. They address the problems, write a few lines of instructions, think of other issues, write a few more lines, and so on. The result is what coders call spaghetti code. In my first major programming project, I worked with a couple of programmers whose output was truly spaghetti code. It took more time to add a single modification than it took to write in the first place. And finding bugs, that took forever. Coders avoid repeating previous mistakes. A good memory helps. So does the ability to see both the larger abstraction and the smallest details at once. When coders are producing applications for the same users, they try to make them work the same. That is, the user experience should be similar. If the user knows how to work with one application, they should be able to apply that knowledge to other applications. Coders are detail-oriented. They think in terms of the elements of the code while maintaining a conception of the whole. One of the advances in the techniques of programming is called structured programming, an earlier attempt to provide a healthier diet by reducing the amount of spaghetti. Structure in a program is concerned with the division of a program into procedures and sub-procedures. Well-designed procedures have a single function per procedure. The procedure isn't trying to do several unrelated actions. And each function is implemented as much as possible in only one procedure. Code is not replicated. Another advance in the techniques of programming came about as computer scientists and programmers recognized that the functionality and the implementation of many programs are similar. This resulted in the documentation of what are called design patterns that encoded the best practices for common algorithms. Coders design before coding. Having an overall view makes it easier to write the individual statements and procedures. I think of this as being equivalent to a carpenter's policy to measure twice and cut once. Coders also practice what we call defensive programming. That means writing code that protects itself against bad outcomes. Some examples are validation. Each procedure tests its inputs, which must match what's expected. Errors. Each procedure has internal tests for erroneous conditions, particularly bad results from sub-procedures. Recovery, including code to recover from errors and provide some minimum functionality rather than crashing. Security. Programs only allow users to perform authorized functions. Coders also apply programming rules. Some of these are promulgated by computer scientists. Others are learned by personal experience. Either way, the rules coders follow will be the same. Our experiences are similar. Many of these rules are expressed as standards. We follow standard naming conventions. A procedure's name describes what the procedure does in the form of a verb or verb phrase. A variable's name describes what it is in the form of a noun or noun phrase. We write statements in certain orders that experience has proven them most reliable and comprehensible. We follow standard rules of typography, such as only one statement per line and using indentation to indicate nested statements. Code for comprehension and maintainability. When I started programming, we were very concerned about the speed of our programs, but computers today are a bit faster. My college had an IBM 360 Model 60, which at the time was one of the fastest computers in the world. 30 years later, about 30 years ago, I had a handheld computer about the size of a smartphone with the same power as that 360. And today, after another 30 years, that smartphone has the same power as the supercomputers of 30 years before. So we don't worry nearly as much about speed. Instead, we write our programs to be comprehensible to other coders and to ourselves when we come back to them after working on lots of other projects. After all, while computers have gotten much faster, our thinking processes haven't. Coders also write documentation. What's the difference between comprehensible code and documentation? One's for coders, the other's for users. Despite the claims of all too many programmers that it just works, very few programs are comprehensible without written documentation. For example, did you know that when Microsoft Windows was introduced, one of the design criteria was that anything you could do with the mouse, you could also do with the keyboard, and vice versa? In my experience teaching users, not 1 in 100 was aware of that. While it's more honored in the breach than in the observance today, it's still a useful rule of thumb. And when users have to interact with many functions of an application and different modes of operation, written documentation and help files are a lot better than learning by exploration. We coders sometimes think of documentation as programming the user. Like many professionals, coders are expected to continue learning throughout their careers. That's not to say that programming is a professional endeavor. In fact, I once came very close to getting fired for pointing that out. Although various organizations have attempted to create standard tests for professional programmers, akin to the bar exam or the qualifying exams for medical professionals, nobody has been successful. Programming, especially coding, is too diverse, too rapidly changing, and too young compared to the real professions. However, as a coder gains in experience, their responsibilities widen, which requires learning about new aspects of the job. Also, as computer scientists and researchers publish new theories and methodology, coders need to adopt those into the work. One of the reasons that I retired after 45 years as a coder was that it became harder and harder to keep up with all the new knowledge. Coder fits my definition of an engineer. Many people think of engineers as people who have passed a licensing exam in one of the engineering disciplines like hydraulic, electrical, or structural engineering. Those capital E engineers are not necessarily what I'm thinking of. In fact, many of them are cookbook engineers who follow existing designs, modifying them as necessary according to their mathematical calculations. To me, an engineer is a person whose overall outlook is solving problems encountered in their life. An engineer parses everything into a series of steps, understanding the why and how of each step. An engineer can create new procedures by cobbling together the steps from existing procedures. My next door neighbor, Mel, has great difficulty watching television. He has the TV, the cable box, the sound bar, and the DVD player, each with its own remote control. He can't remember which remote does what, or even which kinds of entertainment come from the cable box and which, via the TV, from the internet. I, on the other hand, can construct in my head the series of steps to get from a cable program to a YouTube stream, and then perform the steps, which leaves him gazing at me in undeserved awe. Coders certainly fit my definition of an engineer. Now I'd like to turn from coding to coders, that is, the personality of a coder. Coders are almost invariably loners. I know that for the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of discussion of team programming. There's even a technique called pair programming, where two programmers share a keyboard and a screen. One programmer does the typing while the two engage in a running conversation about the development of the code. Coders, on the other hand, conduct that conversation internally. I'm not saying that coders can't be part of a team. Coders can even manage a team of programmers, but it's a rare coder who can manage a team that includes non-programmers. For a high-level coder, having the advantage of directing multiple programmers who can implement a program faster than a single coder can be very satisfying. In addition, being a mentor can be a great joy. On the other hand, coders can concentrate very deeply, more on that later, and often work in very long sessions. That's no place for person-to-person interaction. But most coders are introverts as well as loners. Coders tend to let other people organize social activities. In fact, coders separate social activities from work. Coders are the ideal occupants for cubicle farms, and they tend to be overly distracted by open work environments. I've never understood companies that provide all the comforts of life, including free meals, toys and games, massages, haircuts, laundry, and dry cleaning at the work site. I doubt that extroverts want to be limited to a single location and a single group of people all the time, and introverts don't want to do everything in the group. The work environment should be for work. Life is lived elsewhere. There's a psychological term that I've been seeing for the past couple of decades. That term is flow. Flow is a mental state of intense concentration that excludes almost all external sensations and permits the practitioner to perform mental work much more efficiently and for longer periods of time. Coders hunger for flow. It usually takes upwards of an hour to achieve flow in coding. Any interruption, such as a meeting, a phone call, or even an email, disrupts flow. Because it can take so long to resume flow, coders tend to avoid interruptions like the plague. To a coder, work is its own reward. The coding is the fun part of the workday. Everything else is the grind that has to be endured to get to the coding. Back in 1981, Tracy Kidder published a book entitled The Soul of a New Machine. In it, he described the history of a computer company, Data General Corporation, in creating a new computer design. A team of hardware engineers and coders worked ridiculously long hours to bring a design to fruition in a ridiculously short period of time. What struck me as I read the epilogue was the number of participants who were looking to do it again. The work is its own reward. Oddly enough, coders tend to be extremely loyal to their projects. The work environment has to be truly awful to persuade a coder to abandon a project. I'll have more to say about awful environments later. Please note that doesn't apply to most programmers who will cheerfully leave a project for a better one, for more money, or just because. But coders feel an attachment to their work that discourages leaving it undone. Before I continue with my thoughts, I'd like to read you a document entitled Coders Don't Eat Quiche. But first, I have two warnings. In case it doesn't become immediately obvious, this is a satire. This was written more than 40 years ago, so some of it may seem obsolete. Real coders don't eat quiche. They like Twinkies, Coke, and palate-scorching Szechuan food. Real coders never work 9 to 5. If any real coders are around at 9 a.m., it's because they were up all night. Real coders can talk entirely in numbers and acronyms. Real coders don't play tennis or any other sport which requires a change of clothes. Mountain climbing is okay, and real coders wear climbing boots to work in case a mountain should suddenly spring up in the middle of the machine room. Real coders don't drive clapped-out Chevettes or BMWs or Volvos less than 12 years old. They prefer Lincolns or pickup trucks with floor shifts. Fast motorcycles are highly regarded. Real coders like dirty jokes. This type of joke provides a welcome respite from thinking too hard. Real coders don't like the team programming concept, unless, of course, they are the chief programmer. Real coders have no use for managers. Managers are a necessary evil. They exist only to deal with personnel bozos, bean counters, senior planners, and other congenital defectives. Real coders do not attend technical education courses. They realize that to do so would convert them into a Susie or Sammy programmer, which can be a fate worse than death. See structured programming. Real coders do not use profs. Profs' sole purpose is to provide Gumby managers with an excuse to have terminals in their office. Real coders do not wear suits, ties, a second. Real coders do not wear suits, ties, high-heeled shoes, or color-coordinated clothes. To do so would qualify them as managers, C managers. Real coders do not conduct meetings. Meetings are for saps that write a lot of useless plans, then get the real coders to do the work anyway. Real coders do not make foils. They believe that anything that cannot be shown on a terminal is not worth showing. All right, this goes on for a while, but I think it gets to be long and repetitive. So I am going to stop there. Okay, a coder's life is not without challenges. The challenges tend to be of two general categories: other people and employers. The worst other people are programmers who shouldn't be. I had several jobs where I was working with people who had no business being programmers. Either they lied outright about their skills and abilities. George Santos, anybody? Schemed to oust anybody more capable, or they simply engage in what is now known as quiet quitting, doing as little work as possible. And as little work as possible could actually be none. I worked with a programmer who was a professional bridge player. He could recite bridge games from years ago, card by card, trick by trick. He spent all his time at work on the phone, arranging bridge games or talking to other bridge players. I kept track, and in 6 months, he contributed only 6 lines of code to our project. There are plenty of other people who add frustration to a coder's day. Managers who were never programmers and therefore don't understand the needs and obstacles facing their staff. Administrators, such as human resources geeks, who think of coders as low-level, unintelligent, easily replaceable peons and treat coders like dirt. Marketing and salespeople. Remember that I said that coders tend to be introverts? Guess what kind of work extroverts find easy? People who have no idea of the work that goes into creating and maintaining programs. Earlier, I mentioned that I almost lost my job, pointing out that programming is not a profession. I had just finished working on a project that took me and my team several months to produce a multimedia application at a time that was used as a demonstration of capabilities. This was at a time when multimedia was more a buzzword than an existing technology. One of the marketers who was going to present the demonstration came from the television industry. He came to my team and said, "This is a great episode. Can you have 2 or 3 more ready in a couple of weeks?" Other people outside the workplace tend not to be so much of a challenge to getting work done. After all, they're not there. As far as employers go, most are terrible. I should know. In 45 years, I worked for at least 20 different employers. Even when I was working for myself, I was a terrible employer. I'm also a Jonah. Not one of the companies, and this includes my own consulting firms, that I worked for is still in operation today. My very first full-time job was with a manufacturer of small computers called Digital Equipment Corporation, commonly known by the acronym DEC. For the first couple of years, I really enjoyed working with hardware engineers. But then, Robert Levering wrote a book entitled A Great Place to Work: What Makes Some Employers So Good and Most So Bad. One of his examples was DEC. My subsequent years at DEC were the exception that proves the rule. I worked with a pseudo programmer who poisoned management against me. Eventually, they came to their senses, got rid of him, and restored me to the kind of position I deserved. But then they hired a number of other pseudo programmers, including fanatic bridge players. They replaced management with management specialists with no programming background, ignored maintenance issues, and generally let everything go to pot. At one point, I was spending all my time in the field because my part of the product was working flawlessly, and everybody else's work was so buggy and so behind schedule that it required massive support at the customer site. On one of my short returns to the office, I complained about the situation. The marketing director called me into his office and explained that because they didn't need me to do any more coding for the moment, I was being used to disguise the fact that the product wasn't ready, wasn't working, and wasn't what the customer needed. That was awful enough that I abandoned the hope of doing any more productive coding and left the company. I've had other employers where the challenge wasn't to me directly, but to the survival of the company. I worked for a medium-sized, about 300 people company that was acquired by a rogue from California. I believe he ended up in jail for some of his fraudulent practices. He discovered that he wasn't the only or even the worst fraud. The directors from whom he purchased the company had been leasing systems and booking them as sales as well as annuity income to inflate their value. He literally put the company into reverse. The sales department was buying back systems that had been sold to customers to avoid having to support them. The purchasing department was selling inventory. Manufacturing was laid off. Programming was told to start working on new systems to replace the discarded work of over a decade. There were other shenanigans that did affect me more directly, but that's for another time. Today, there's a lot of talk about big tech and how we need to regain control over the big five: Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Amazon. Given my experience, I think we may be overstressing about them. At least 4 of the 5 are showing signs of senescence at just about the same age that many of my employers did. Finally, after all this talk about what coders do and what they are, I'd like to reward those of you who are still awake with a discussion of the spirituality of coders. Coders aren't very fond of organized religion. They tend to prefer disorganized religion, which is why I'm a UU. In particular, disorganized religions don't have creeds, so they welcome just about everybody. They do have principles, however. For me, the principle that convinced me that Unitarian Universalism was my spiritual home was the 4th principle: a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. I don't want to accept someone else's ideas. I want to do the reading and thinking to develop my own. By the way, for those of you who haven't seen my comments in the Weekly Reader, the UUA is in the process of completely replacing our principles. New principles, if you want to call them that, are much longer, more diffuse, and I personally find them disappointing. You can read them on the UUA website and form your own opinion. Coders are justice seekers. On a personal level, a coder would rather be rewarded for their own actions and efforts. Getting ahead should be based on those. I don't object to entrepreneurs who produce value by creating products and creating jobs. I do object very strongly to the Wall Street types and politicians who game the system to earn as much money and as much power as possible, the people who prefer to gain at the expense of others. You may remember me talking about the conflict in the American ethos between community and individuality. We tend to idealize the pioneers, especially the explorers who didn't need anybody else. But the people who really built this country and who fit the ideals of the founding fathers were the settlers and the urban dwellers who both needed and supported each other. By the way, Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem titled The Explorer. It's rather long, 15 stanzas or more, but it's one of my favorites because it describes so perfectly the loner aspect of coder's personality. When we engage in racial and social justice work, which is so important to our congregation, we are supporting the community, often against the raging individuals who try to control everyone else. However, for a coder, the community is not at work. Work is for being a loner and for achieving flow. Work is work, and life is life. In my life, my most important community is the one I'm speaking to now. May it be so.
If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video. Thank you.